Welcome back to U.S. Farm Report this weekend. Well, Lance Honig with NASS. He's the director of the methodology division, but also he is the chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board. Lance, we talked about it in news, but the USDA reports, those produced several surprises this week that sent commodity prices lower. I think the biggest surprise that we're hearing was the increase in both corn yield and production. How was both the yield and production, how was that data gathered for this report?
Well, tying for the end of the season, it's really largely driven by a large survey we do of producers, about 73,000. We do that in the month of December, which means it's after harvest. So we're actually asking a large number of producers, after everything's in the bin, how many acres did you plant? How many did you harvest? How many, bushels did you actually harvest from those acres? What was your resulting yield? And so it's just actual results from a large pool of farmers. We do also have final results from the objective yield survey work that we did as well, which means those sample plots that we lay out across the key growing area across the country. And so a lot of data after the crop has already been not only grown, but harvested that are really just giving us actual results.
Well, you mentioned a large farmer survey. What was the response rate like for this January survey and report?
So for this survey, this go around, it was about 40.2%. We had about 46% last year, so not terribly out of line with what we've seen recently for this time of year. Obviously, more response is always better than less, but if you compare that to what most folks in survey business are doing, that's actually still quite good. But my message to all farmers would still be, if you want to see, what you can do to possibly make these numbers even more accurate, the more response we get, more data is obviously going to lead to our ability to be even more accurate.
Let's dive into the acreage piece for just a second, because, Lance, what caused such a large uptick in acreage from June to January, and why did it take so long to make such a big adjustment? I mean, isn't that acreage data, isn't that largely known in June? Is it typically do you make this big of an adjustment from June to January?
So this was definitely a larger change between June and January than we would typically see. There's really two components. You really got to break the acreage down, though, because you've got your planted area, and then you've got, of that total, how many of the acres were harvested for grain. Obviously, big changes from June to January in both cases. But from a planted perspective, we picked this almost all up back in August and September. In fact, planted area only coming up about 60,000 acres since we last published that number. But the big swing that really drove the production change in January was that harvested acreage increase. And so we had been inching that up as we moved the planted area up. But what we didn't know, since we didn't have any new data about how many of those acres would be harvested for grain since June, we were assuming the same planted to harvested ratio that farmers told us back in June. But in reality, after going back at the end of the season and getting that final data, what we discovered was that with that big uptick in acres from what they had reported back in June, a larger portion of those, quote, I'll call them extra acres, not really extra, but those additional acres, a much larger proportion of those were harvested for grain than what we would have thought back in June. And in hindsight, I think you can make sense of that because, what happens to the planted area? You either harvest it for grain, you harvest it for silage, or you abandon it. And when it comes to silage, we just don't see that much variation from year to year. You don't suddenly just decide you're going to, utilize a lot more silage. This is not how it works. And of course, with the weather we had this year, no big uptick in abandoned acres either. And so again, hindsight's 2020, but I think it does make sense that a higher portion of the large planted total this year actually got harvested for grain.
And all of that you found out from the farmer survey, or is there any FSA data that you look at to come up with that harvested acreage number?
So when it comes to the harvested acreage, the survey is really the driver. Planted acreage absolutely is the FSA data. That's what you certify as a producer with FSA. How many acres you planted. You do report your harvest intention. There's some data we can look at there, but the reality is that's reported back in the spring, maybe early summer. And so until you find out what actually happened, you really don't know for sure what that harvested area looks like.
And so, Lance, when we look, though, at planted acres, how many acres of corn Did farmers actually plant this year?
They actually planted 98.8 million acres, which was, again, we've talked about 3.6 million more than we thought back in June or March, for that matter. Numbers were pretty similar back in that time frame. But if you look back to that timeline, I was looking back myself at what some of the expectations were going into those March and June reports, and there was really nobody thinking much bigger than that back then either. So this is really just surprising, not only based on what farmers said back in that time frame, but what really most people watching the situation thought back then as well. So really just a big uptick in acres from what anybody thought earlier this year.
Lance, I know you've seen the farmer frustration. You've heard the farmer frustration. What is the one thing you do want farmers to know?
These are all data-driven decisions. We have one purpose at NASS, and that's to try to estimate everything as accurately as we can, as quickly as we can. In fact, that's why we've started making these planted acreage updates earlier in the season by incorporating that FSA data back in August and September. Even though we still ended up with a fairly big jump here at the end, it's a lot smaller than it would have been if we weren't able to incorporate that data even sooner. And moving forward, we're going to continue to find ways to make things even better year after year, just as we've always done. But we're really going to dig in between now and June and see if there's anything we can do to make the process even better.
Lance, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Well, we need to take a quick break, and then, you look at the forecast right now, and NOAA's talking about La Nina making an exit, possibly El Nino entering the picture. Well, Drew Lerner, what does he think about all of that? We have your forecast next.